Super Bowl 44, February 2010. On the field for the New Orleans Saints, a 6'5", 250-pound linebacker with a Japanese name, Fugita. But a closer look at Scott Fugita reveals a Japanese American with a decidedly un-Japanese looking face.
It's funny because I don't want to reach it all and tie everything to my upbringing or my family's history, but that might be a huge part of me being the way that I am.
And who Scott Fugita is a leader on and off the field. A man who recognized that football could help New Orleans to recover from catastrophe.
We recognized it as a chance to be a part of something that was much bigger than just football. Much bigger than just football.
The story of Scott Fugita is a story about a unique man raised in America with Japanese traditions and Japanese values. A story about a man who isn't Japanese by blood, who is still proud of his Japanese heritage, a man who lives by the spirit of his Japanese ancestors.
Scott's story was one I'd followed from the first time I saw his name on a jersey, Fugita. I wondered about his ethnicity. Welcome to our program. I'm Frank Buckley. And while Buckley isn't a traditional Japanese name either, I too am half Japanese. In my case, my mother is Japanese, my late father Caucasian. So I too am half Japanese. But unlike Scott, I'm half Japanese by blood. In fact, my Japanese mother used to say to me when I was growing up, "Anata no karada ni wa Nihonjin no chi ga nagareteru no yo, wasurei de ne," which means, don't forget, you have Japanese blood in you too. Still, growing up, I was frequently asked questions like, what are you? Are you Japanese or American? Caucasian or Asian? I wondered if Scott faced those same questions. How you doing?
Good, Frank. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Nice to meet you in person finally.
No, absolutely. Been seeing you on TV for years.
Welcome to Little Tokyo.
Thank you. I haven't been here in a long time. Used to come occasionally as a kid, and I've been out of state for years, so good to come back.
In some ways, we both represent the changing face of Japanese Americans. We both proudly identify ourselves as Japanese Americans, yet neither of us fit the stereotype. But Scott's story of how he came to identify as a Japanese American is also different from mine. While I was born of a Caucasian father and a Japanese mother, Scott was adopted by a Japanese American father and a Caucasian mother, Rodney and Helen Fugita of Camarillo, California. They also adopted another Caucasian baby, Jason, Scott's older brother.
Well, we were unable to have children, but we wanted children. So we adopted. And so first we adopted our oldest son, Jason, and then we wanted more children, and we were able to adopt Scott.
Obviously, we didn't look like your typical family. We had one little blonde, blue-eyed boy and another brown-haired, green-eyed boy, so yeah.
I always knew that I was adopted, and listen, I'm not delusional. I recognize that I don't have a single drop of Japanese blood in my body, but when it comes down to it, what is race? And really, race is just a label.
Fugitas raised their boys in an American household with Japanese traditions.
And these are for Scott. It's a little coat. Holidays, for example, Boys' Day, well, that's also in Japan. New Year's, we would go to family members' houses and eat Japanese food.
I feel very fortunate to be adopted into the family that I was adopted into. I mean, fantastic parents, a wonderful older brother. And on top of that, I had the privilege of being exposed to a very unique culture that I otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to. So I felt very privileged and lucky. And I almost felt like, my brother and I were chosen. It's interesting, when you're adopted, you feel like you were chosen, and that makes you more special. Like, as if your parents walked into this nursery and they had thousands of infants to choose from, and they chose you, which isn't the truth, but I grew up feeling that way, and I think that's very valuable.
When we were fishing one weekend up at June Lake, he met a little boy around his age who stayed in the cabin next door. And he said, "My name is Scott, I'm Japanese." And the little boy sort of looked at him like, "Really?"
I run up to the kids in the next camp over, and 4 years old, "Hey, I'm Scott, and I'm Japanese." And people would look at me like, "This guy's crazy."
I had a similar experience as a kid living in Japan. I was 4 years old, and my father is Caucasian, my mother is Japanese, and I was raised around Japanese people at the time, spoke Japanese.
Right.
And young Japanese kids would often look at Caucasian people and say, "Gaijin da, gaijin da." And my parents used to love to remind me that when I was that age, I looked at a Caucasian guy and said, "Gaijin da!" And they said to me, "You're Gaijin."
Right,
And
that's funny.
all my life, people have been trying to put me in a box, asking me, "What are you?
Right.
Are you Japanese? Are you American? Are you Asian American? Are you Caucasian? What are you?" So, have people asked you that question? What are you?
I think the best way to answer that is I'm a good person. And I try to be a good person every day. The whole label thing, I'm very uncomfortable with that. Like you, trying to be put into a box. Even the debate over should this guy be considered Japanese or not. I grew up feeling like I was half Japanese. Why should anybody else have a problem with that? I was exposed to that culture. I was loved by my parents and my family. There are certain things that I think I was able to draw from that culture, and that's all that matters. The label thing to me can be dangerous sometimes. This is my grandfather Nagao and me when I was probably 6 or 7 years old. And here's another picture of him during the war when he was part of the 442nd Battalion and fighting overseas in France.
Scott's grandfather, Nagao Fugita, and other Japanese Americans of his generation know that firsthand. Nagao, a second-generation Japanese American, a Nisei, was a student at Cal Berkeley when Pearl Harbor was attacked.
Of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, history that 130 million Americans will never forget. And in days to come, the Japs, too, will remember Pearl Harbor.
The attack further deepened an anti-Japanese sentiment which had already existed in the country. Jap became a derogatory term used in place of Japanese. It was used to refer to the enemy. Even loyal Americans of Japanese descent found themselves being called Japs. Decades later, Scott would feel the sting of that hurtful word on the football field.
And I remember at one point messing up on a play, and one of the offensive coaches at the time yells out, "Come on, Fugita, you're japping us." And it was one of those where I kind of froze, and a lot of people on the team froze and looked at me to sort of gauge my response and what was I going to do. And I sat there and I was just like, I was kind of shocked to hear it. I didn't even know how to respond. And I just sort of took it, I never forgot about it. And I saw that coach probably 12 or 13 years later, and he was an NFL coach at the time. And I went and I confronted him on it. And we had a conversation, and he said, "Listen, Scott, I don't recall saying that." He said, "If I did, I apologize." And he said, "I've grown up a lot since then even. I grew up in a place where things like that were said. Doesn't make it right, but it was sort of a common part of our vernacular. And I apologize." And how can you not forgive someone like that? Obviously, this is something I carried around with me forever. Yeah. And there was a strong lesson in that, too. I mean, people do grow, people do evolve once they're exposed to new things or they're told, hey, that wasn't right. They even had, when I got to Kansas City, our special teams coach, they had a term there, and it was called the Jap. It was called the Jap. So there was the punt team and the punt return team. And when you're playing football on the punt return team, occasionally you have the two guys, they're called hold-up guys on the outside, and occasionally they'll creep in, kind of sneak in and try to rush off the edge to block the punt. Well, when you're on the punt team, there's one guy who's the fullback who's in charge of identifying the punt return team, and they'd look out, and if they saw one of those hold-up guys starting to creep in, do this sort of surprise attack, they would yell out, "Jap, jap, 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 jap." And that was just, and a lot of teams use this.
Wow.
And I remember that was my rookie year, and again, I'm trying to figure out my place and where do I fit in. And I went and approached the coach at one point, and I say, way beyond inappropriate for us to talk. And he didn't even think of it that way. He said, honestly, Scott, that's just the way that's the word we've always used. And he explained kind of the origin of it. And I said, no, that's not the origin of it.
Yeah.
Your interpretation of it is completely wrong. I don't care what your coach did when you were in high school.
Yeah.
And he was like, man, I never even thought about it that way. The next day, we didn't say it anymore.
I don't think people realize how hurtful
Right.
that term is.
Right, in a way that's not meant to be offensive. You know, I call it sort of casual homophobia. In some cases, there's what's called casual racism, where someone doesn't mean to be offensive, but they grew up using those words.
Yeah.
Or, you know, to me, most people are a product of where they come from or a product of the environment that allows them to behave in a certain way.
Yeah.
So until you actually pull someone aside and say, you know, that's actually an offensive term. I know you don't mean it to be offensive. And then sometimes they say, you know what, I never even thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So there's a very diplomatic way to approach people, I think.
Right.
Today, there's no one doing more to teach others about the Japanese-American experience than the people at the Japanese-American National Museum in downtown Los Angeles. And Scott recently had the opportunity to witness those efforts firsthand. Greg Kimura is president and CEO of the museum.
An American story, we want to make sure it never goes away.
Right,
So
right.
as part of that, the core exhibit of the museum is entitled Common Ground, Heart of Community. And we tell the story of Japanese America from its earliest beginnings, the immigration to the United States, and the challenges that are not dissimilar from any group that comes from far away and tries to make a home in the United States.
The experience of Scott Fugita's family is part of that history. His grandfather Nagao had met his future wife Lily while attending university. When it became clear that Japanese Americans were going to be forced into internment camps, they quickly married so they wouldn't be separated. Eventually, some 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent, men, women, and children, were forced from their homes, farms, and businesses and relocated to internment camps where they lived in hastily built barracks.
Well, we're standing here now, right in the middle of an actual barrack from one of America's concentration camps. This one was actually from Hart Mountain, Wyoming, and it was taken apart plank by plank and brought back to the museum here and reconstructed here as part of our permanent exhibit, Common Ground.
So dimensions then, this is about the size of this particular barrack.
It was exactly
Okay.
the size. So
Okay.
you can go and you can see this. You know, people talk about the freezing winds and
Right.
the cold, and you see that these are, you know, the tolerances. There were no tolerances between the planks and the tar paper shacks essentially. Dozens of people, scores of people, and families, you know, smashed into these small places. These really inhuman living conditions.
Right.
And there was no such thing as privacy, so families would put down towels or blankets and
Right.
to kind of have a little bit of separation.
Right.
People remember those small violations,
Right.
and they remember them as very personal hurts.
You know, the barracks had spaces between the boards, and it would just blow into to the room. And sometimes we'd get up in the morning and we'd be all dusty because it's sand. Nuggets and Lily were newlyweds, so my mother, they gave us blanket and mattress. And I don't know whether they gave us sheets or not. But anyway, my mother put up blankets so that we could partition the room, the barrack into separate rooms so they'd get a little privacy.
You know, I remember when I first heard about it, I was just perplexed by it. I mean, the fact that something like that happened in the United States of America. And I also remember growing up and I was frustrated and almost angered that we never talked about this stuff. We talk about U.S. history in school, you know, from first grade on up, and that subject never came up. So I was always almost angered by that. Like, this seems like a huge chapter in American history, and why aren't we even talking about this? Especially in light of recent events in 2001, where it seems like that's such a poignant conversation to be having in light of the hysteria, you know, post 9/11. So yeah, there was always that component. So I would reach out and I would talk to friends about it, and again, they were always shocked and surprised. And to me, the value of telling my family's story over the years, especially on a broader scale in the NFL, was that the idea of adoption always came up, which is important to me, but also the story of Japanese internment would come up in those conversations. And people around the country, perhaps in the South or the Midwest, who may have never heard about that, also get to hear about it for the first time. So to me, there's a lot of value in that. On the flip side, you also start to, you know, become more aware of some of the prejudice that's out there. You know, someone might do a story on me in Louisiana, and again, Japanese internment gets discussed, and I get a letter from, you know, what's supposedly a fan in the South, and it says, you know, hey, those Japs got what they deserved. And so to see that there's still that component out there is troubling, and that to me says that we need to keep telling the story.
And part of Scott's family history was written in a barrack in Arizona, where his grandmother Lily became pregnant with the baby who would someday become Scott's father, Rodney.
Lily didn't have much milk, and so the baby came home early, and he cried all the time because he was hungry. That was very difficult for her.
I do know that that my mother had some complications during delivery, and that she was injected with some sort of medication that she was highly allergic to, and they were barely able to save her.
Lily would have to care for the baby by herself because Nagao Fugita was bound for war, to fight for the very country which had incarcerated him, his wife, and now their baby son in an internment camp. Nagao was joining the famed 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated unit of Japanese-American soldiers who came to be known for their motto, "Go for broke."
I volunteered from a relocation center to show my loyalty and to prove that I had the right to live as a good American citizen.
Their heroic actions now legendary in the annals of military history. The 442nd would become one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. President Harry Truman later saying,
"You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you've won."
Well, you don't want to get hurt. You know that's kind of a basic thing, but you never know. It only takes maybe one bullet or one shell to knock you out, you know.
I'm fighting over here for the better things of life and to preserve the American way of living.
He was a lieutenant in our company. So when we have what they call it, inspector generals, and come and inspect us, well, he's one of the officers had to go through with them, you know. I wouldn't say he was a problem, but, you know, like the other officers, you know, we had Caucasian officers, they kind of feel too high up. But he's like one of us, you know, but he's still following the regulations. But the other ones, you know, you can't like talk to him, but him being a Japanese American, you know, you could talk to him, you know.
He never played this high and mighty stuff. He was, as a friend, he was a friend. That's the way he operated. That's the way he was.
I think stories like this are really important. The museum, our entire existence is to make sure that the story is never forgotten.
Right.
We remember these things. but not just for people like you and for me, but because this is also an important American story.
Right.
It gets to the heart of telling a story of when America did not live up to its own ideals, but also of how through hard work and through perseverance, gaman, the community can then rebuild and establish itself, and that America can learn from its mistakes.
Scott recently had a chance to visit the Go for Broke monument, dedicated to the more than 16,000 Japanese American soldiers who served during World War II. It had special meaning.
You know, my grandfather was 442nd, so I've always wanted to come here to visit. You both, looks like you were 442nd as well? Yeah.
Scott had a chance to hear some of the stories of the World War II veterans firsthand.
There was about 11 to 12,000 guys, you know, like a replacement like me that went through the 442.
Scott also had a chance to find, among the names of those who served, the name of his own grandfather, Nagao Fugita.
It was moving because I had heard that his name was here, and I've known that this monument has been here for years. But when you actually see it in person, I think it's a different meaning. It shows you that this truly is a place where they're honored the right way, and it makes me proud of him. My grandfather especially now. My grandfather spoiled his grandsons rotten. I mean, he just loved us. He used to come to pick us up from elementary school, and we lived probably a 5-minute walk from the school that my brother and I went to. Well, he'd come in his car, he'd pick us up, and instead of taking us straight home, he might take us shopping and then take us to get some ice cream and bring us home 5:30, maybe 6 o'clock, and never call my mom to tell her that he had us and we were fine the whole time. So she's out there worried sick about us. We're just cruising around with our grandpa hanging out. That's the kind of guy he was.
Your grandmother?
My grandmother Lily was special. She just passed away this year, and she was very regal and just graceful and kind, and probably the most forgiving person I've ever met.
Knowing your sort of background and your father and your grandparents, how did it affect how you felt about your own identity?
I think it always gave me a chip on my shoulder, and I kind of grew up with these, you know, I don't want to say they were conflicting, but really they're completely opposite. There's this idea of, you know, go for broke. My grandfather Nagao, he enlisted like many, you know, brave Japanese Americans did in the 442nd, Infantry Regiment team, and became the most decorated battalion in the history of American combat. I mean, to me, those were heroes. And in spite of what their family was being put through, they chose to show their loyalty to their country and go overseas and fight for this country. To me, that makes them a hero. Went on to become a lawyer, was the first multilingual attorney in Ventura County, represented pretty much all the Japanese Americans, and it was a pretty large Japanese American community in Oxnard, represented and defended all the Hispanics in the area. He was that guy, so people just adored him. And I did as well. So I had this one, you know, idea of go for broke. That's my grandfather, who was a very kind of assertive, ambitious guy. And then on the other standpoint, it's, you know, shikata ganai, this idea of, hey, there's nothing you can do about it, just make the best of it. So I kind of grew up with these two sort of conflicting philosophies. And I got to be honest, growing up, I think I probably had more of that go for broke mentality, where I had this incredible chip on my shoulder. I was upset that no one stood up for my family at that time. And, you know, how could you just sit back and let this happen to you? But then when you talk to someone like my grandmother, again, she says, I was just trying to make the best of the situation. And she was incredibly, you know, forgiving. And I'm glad to be able to absorb that into my own life. And I feel like as I've aged and as I've matured, you know, as much as I've always tried to be out front and trying to fight for this cause and that cause, as I've aged and I have children now, I find myself really trying to be more like my grandmother. And it's a funny thing to say that after wanting to fight for years and years and years. But she just always seemed at peace, and there's something very special about that.
And along with Scott's grandmother's pearls of wisdom came another piece of advice passed down by his grandfather, Nagao.
The main thing was that if you're going to do something, do your best, do it correctly or do it right. And I tried to pass that on to my sons.
And Scott did just that. He tried to be the best from the moment he decided he wanted to play football at the age of 8. But first, he had to convince his parents to let him play.
And I was still unsure because of his age, but they had an open house. So I thought, well, here's a chance to meet the coaches and talk to them a little bit, because from what I had seen, when I would hold practices in high school, there were the youth teams practicing nearby, and the coaches, it seemed as though they weren't teachers. They were always yelling and screaming, and I didn't want that. I didn't believe in that. And so Scott asked me if he was going to be able to play football, and I said, well, Scott, I'm not sure yet. And he started, tears started forming in his eyes, and he started saying, I'll never be able to play football. And that just broke my heart. So that's, okay, you're playing.
Scott excelled through Pop Warner football, but even as a boy, opponents wondered, who is this kid named Fugita?
He was like a star, you know what I mean? In Pop Warner, he was always the fastest kid in school. And it's funny too, because with the last name, people always gave me those looks like, wait, Fugita, like they thought he was joking.
For me, football was never the top priority. As most kids are when they grow up who play sports, obviously you dream of playing professional sports. I never thought that was realistic. I knew what the numbers were. I just played sports because I enjoyed it. So when I was coming out of high school, I was what they call a tweener, kind of in between body sizes, in between positions. No one really knew what to do with me. I probably wasn't ready to play legit Division I football. Wasn't really even getting recruited to play football at any major schools. I mean, some of the Ivy League schools, a few small schools in California. But when I got accepted at Berkeley to go there and be a student, and then they gave me the chance to walk on and play Pac-10 football, it was just a no-brainer. That was a school that I wanted to go to. It was a school that my grandfather had gone to. So for me to have that education, that was the most important thing. Have a chance to compete to earn a scholarship and kind of relieve that financial burden on my parents. That's what football was about. To me, it was more of a launch pad to other things.
Talk about how hard you had to work to get that scholarship eventually.
Oh, geez. I mean, coming out of high school, I was probably 6'4", maybe 200 pounds. So just a beanpole. And you come into this place where all these guys are just gargantuan. So to kind of mature and find my way and have coaches who would believe in me and wanted to give me that opportunity, the opportunity presented itself when I was a freshman. I was going to be a redshirt in my first training camp, and I was a safety at the time, 6'4", 200-pound safety. And the top 3 safeties who were playing ahead of me all got injured in training camp. And I had a broken hand at the time, and I had a gash on my other hand, so both hands were in clubs. And I was back there, and I took every single rep in training camp practices. Now, I wasn't close to ready to play in a game, but that was the first chance where the coaches gave me that opportunity, and they recognized, hey, maybe there is something there with this guy. So I think I was fortunate to fall into a good situation, and it's also recognizing when the opportunity presents itself to take advantage of it.
To be ready.
Right.
And then to show the heart that you obviously had, to be out there with 2 clubs to take every rep.
Yeah, I think some people probably thought, that wasn't real bright of me to do that, but it led to a scholarship, and I think that's where they recognized, hey, maybe this guy's got a little bit of toughness, and he can play a little ball too. It was never easy.
Early on, we were all like smaller people, but as we worked out, we grew in size, and Jess's example is exactly right. When Scott came back from Berkeley, even when he went there, he had already put on quite a bit of weight, but the reason he had done that, it doesn't happen magically. He put in the work, he worked out religiously.
Difficult path, unconventional path. It's never been easy. Those are the kinds of words that you use. And I think, can you apply those things to the rest of your life, or is that just a football thing?
No, I think to everything in my life. And it's not, I'd love to sit here and say, well, I outworked everybody else, and that's why I got what I got. I also had some people giving me those opportunities. There's a lot of people who have been in my corner who for some reason saw something in me and said, hey, let's give this guy a shot. So I'm forever grateful for that.
Scott would go to whatever ends he could to, again, improve himself, go way above what everybody else was doing and what was expected of him. So that's kind of, again, why he is where he is and been where he's been.
He really understood what you were trying to do, and he knew where people were supposed to be lined up, what their keys were, and what their reaction to the keys should be, so he could take care of those issues on the field.
after completing college, Scott was drafted by the Kansas City Chiefs, where he led the team in tackles in 2003 and 2004.
You went from safety to linebacker when you were at Cal.
Right.
You played linebacker in the NFL. What does that mean to be a linebacker?
I always joke with people when I speak at schools or with young kids, and they always want to meet the quarterback. Hey, Scott, do you know Reggie Bush? Or hey, do you know Drew Brees? Yeah, of course I know them. They're my teammates. Then I always say, hey, you guys know who the smartest guys on the team are? And they always say, quarterback. And I say, no, it's the linebackers. And they get all disappointed to hear that. But I say, no, because the defensive players, they have to be the smartest because they have to react to everything the offense is doing. And so those offensive guys, they know the play. They come up to the line of scrimmage and they run the play. Defense, we have to respond to everything they're doing. But the linebacker, to me, is the glue that holds the whole defense together. You have to be on top of communication constantly, and you're the glue that holds the defensive line to the secondary.
Talk to us about the role of leadership and how you had to be a leader and what that means to you to be a leader on a team.
I think, I always had a strong work ethic, and I was also someone who wasn't afraid to speak my mind. So for whatever reason, I always found myself in leadership positions. And there's a certain responsibility with that. I mean, you have to carry yourself a certain way. To me, you have to be the first one in the building. You have to show the young guys what it means to work hard, to do the right things. So there is a lot that comes with that.
Scott continues to use his leadership skills off the field to keep interest alive and the dialogue going about the Japanese-American experience of which he is a part. Wherever he can, he shares with others the history and what it means for him to have the last name Fugita.
I think, again, the value in telling the story, and it brings up so many issues of tolerance and acceptance and wanting to fight for the right things. To me, there's a lot of value in that. And everywhere I go, the story kind of gets retold. And I get traded to Dallas, or I go to New Orleans, or in Kansas City, and everybody says, "Hey, what's that last name? Let's talk about it a little bit." And some people might get worn out by the story, but there's value in repeating the story because young kids at home hear about all these things for the first time. So if that makes me a positive role model for them, then I absolutely embrace that responsibility. It's funny because I don't want to reach it all and tie everything to my upbringing or my family's history, but that might be a huge part of me being the way that I am. Again, thinking back to that era and no one really standing up and defending Japanese Americans at the time, I think that's just always given me this chip on my shoulder. So maybe I've always wanted to stand up for the little guy, fighting for things like marriage equality, seeing people who are denied rights. I mean, that was an important issue to me. Things with like immigration reform and like I talked about earlier, someone being called an enemy alien. I mean, just that concept is so dehumanizing. I feel the same thing with the concept of illegal aliens. I mean, there's a certain lack of empathy sometimes you see in this country. And I've always tried to work as much as I can to try to make people more empathetic. And you can do that by telling stories and sharing your own experiences. And to me, that's a huge part of leadership. But again, it was about using football kind of as a head start for everything, everything else in life, as a springboard. And with that, and the celebrity that came with football, I recognize that there's an opportunity here to talk about things, to stand for things at a time where people actually care what you have to say. There's going to come a time now, in a couple years from now, where I'm further removed from this game, where no one's going to care what I have to say. So to me, in that limited window of time that you actually have, you might as well stand for something.
And the story is what? That race doesn't matter, or that ethnicity doesn't matter, or that what?
Ultimately, race as a label doesn't matter. It's more about the family that loves you. Also, though, prejudice is still an issue in this country. And to be able to frame those conversations in a way with an actual element in American history where there was a huge case of racial prejudice and this widespread hysteria post-Pearl Harbor that people have never heard about before, there's tremendous value in them hearing that. So to me, that's why I continue to tell the story.
It was the go for broke story and the philosophy behind it that Scott would bring with him to New Orleans when he joined the Saints in 2006. Scott became the first player to sign with the Saints after its year-long absence from New Orleans caused by the horrors of Hurricane Katrina. After strong years as a rock-solid linebacker and special teams player for the Kansas City Chiefs and the Dallas Cowboys, friends and family wondered, why the Saints?
Your first impression was like, we followed him wherever he went, but we were like, oh, the Saints? there's not that many Saints fans, and like you said, they were not that good, and we were like, oh, the Saints, you know.
To put that into perspective, he was coming from Dallas, which is like the the shining beacon of the NFL, and then now he's going into a city that's just gone through this tragedy and it's in shambles, and no one wants to be there.
Thinking back to when I made the decision to go to New Orleans and driving around, and there still not being any street signs on the street because they had all been blown away. All the restaurants were closed down by and large, and only places that were open were Popeye's Chicken and KFC on every street corner. I mean, it was just a different place. Walking around the streets and the few places that were open, you'd run into them and they'd say, hey, what are you doing here? And you'd say, oh, I actually just signed with the Saints. What, you actually chose to come here? Hey, come on in, let me buy you a beer. And thank you for coming here. How can you not want to deliver them something like a Super Bowl? They invested so much in us, and they put so much into trying to rebuild from Katrina that we had to find a way to deliver. In New Orleans, it's just different. I mean, the link between the community and that team is strong and it's real. So to come in at a time in 2006 where we didn't even know if we'd have a stadium to play in, and a lot of people didn't know if they had homes to live in. You're just kind of married together. And for us to sort of be this symbolic, symbol, the symbol of the city's rebirth, and to give some people a distraction from from the trouble in their lives, there's something special about that. For my wife and I, even though it was a little bit scary at the time, we recognized it as a chance to be a part of something that was much bigger than just football.
It was a chance for Scott to go for broke, helping to rebuild a football team and a city.
And all of us were part of the emotion post-Katrina. We were all rooting for you guys to win. And that first big win, you had a key play in that game. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think we kind of became America's adopted team that year. Everyone always talks about the Cowboys as being America's team. Well, in 2006, everyone adopted us as their team. So here we are in Game 3 of the 2006 season. It's the Superdome reopening, Monday Night Football against the Atlanta Falcons. So it was a huge game. Literally, the paint was still drying on the Superdome walls. I mean, they had to rush just to get the building ready for us to play in. So we show up, and it's funny because the first drive of the game, the Falcons have the ball. It's a third down play, and Michael Vick scrambles out to make a pass, and I sack him, force a fumble. Luckily, the ball rolls out of bounds. We had one of our guys almost pick it up and scoop it and run in for a touchdown, which would have been huge. But the next play was a fourth down play, and my good friend Steve Gleason, who is now living with ALS, comes in and blocks the punt. That is the most iconic play in New Orleans Saints history, and that, to me, triggers the rebirth of the whole community. People joke with me saying that by me sacking and forcing the fumble on Vic, if someone had just recovered it, that would have prevented the biggest play in Saints history. So I'm glad things worked out the way they did.
And all of us were part of the emotion post-Katrina. We were all rooting for you guys to win.
It was a victory shared by the people of New Orleans and by Fugita's friends and family watching on TV sets across the country.
I remember the moment that we won the game, and certainly you think, wow, did we just do that? And you embrace your coach, you embrace your teammates. And my first thought was, where's my family? Because they're getting ready to run onto the field. And I'll never forget my daughters running on with my wife and the confetti falling down from the sky and my girls catching the confetti. I mean, that was a moment that I'll never forget. Yeah, and it's just a game, but that was a moment where it felt so much bigger than a game. To be, again, adopted into the family that I was adopted into. And, they gave me the life that I had. And every opportunity, they were by my side. Every time I had, a tough decision to make, they were there to help counsel me through it and be there with me through it. Every lesson that I learned from my grandparents and all the hardship they had faced, and recognizing that what do I ever have to complain about? I never faced anything like what they went through. So when you really step back and take a responsible, kind of deep look at the whole journey, it just makes you thankful. So I figured what better place to call it the end of the road than right here, high up in the Peruvian Andes, overlooking Machu Picchu with my good friend Steve Gleason.
In 2012, after 11 years in the NFL, Scott knew the time had come to retire from football. Even though he played the last 3 years of his career for the Cleveland Browns, for his dedication to the Saints and to the city of New Orleans, the Saints offered Scott a one-day contract so he could retire as a Saint.
It was very meaningful. I didn't expect for something like that to happen, and the timing of it was interesting because I was just getting ready to fly down to Peru to meet my friend Steve Gleason and carry him up to the peak of Machu Picchu in a wheelchair. So this trip had been getting planned for a long time, And a few days before that trip, I thought, all right, on this trip, I'm going to announce my retirement in some capacity. It just feels like, it feels like the right time. So I called some of my coaches in New Orleans, and they gave the word to the Saints general manager, Mickey Loomis, that I was preparing to retire. So he called me actually as I was at the airport in Houston, getting ready to fly down to Peru, and he said, Scott, we'd love for you to retire as a Saint. And I was emotional. I was just blown away by that, incredibly flattered. And I said, Mickey, I'd be honored.
The next chapter in Scott Fugita's life is just beginning. He's a husband to Jacqueline and a father to Isabel, Delilah, and Marlo. He's a sports commentator who also writes for major publications. He publicly supports and speaks out on causes that are dear to his heart. Giving back has become one of the biggest themes in his life. Scott Fugita, the story of one Japanese American who will never be Japanese by blood, but who will always be proud of who he is. His story, not just about ethnicity, but about values, his many accomplishments, and the others to come, a testament to his family, his character, as well as his heritage.
I think growing up, people always wanted me to identify myself and say, what do you consider yourself? What race are you? But when you're adopted, it's less about blood relations. It's about the family that you're raised by, the family you feel most connected to. So really, when it comes down to it, what is race? Race is just a label.